The oil on the flat-top griddle hissed, a sharp, rhythmic sound that filled the small, cramped space of the metal cart. Elena wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, her movements practiced and weary. She was 26, but the skin around her eyes felt heavy, etched with the exhaustion of 3 years spent on this specific corner of a gray New York City street. Her hands, dusted with flour and scarred by small, forgotten grease burns, flipped a scallion pancake with mechanical precision. The city moved around her in a blur of expensive wool coats and hurried footsteps, a river of people who looked through her rather than at her. To them, she was part of the sidewalk furniture, as permanent and invisible as a fire hydrant. The sky was bruising into a deep, sickly purple, the kind of dusk that promised a cold, unforgiving night. Elena reached for a plastic container of batter, her fingers numb from the creeping chill. She knew the routine. She stayed until the last commuter vanished into the subway, until the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. It was a life measured in nickels and small, quiet indignities. She didn't mind the work, but she feared the silence of the late hours when the city's teeth began to show. She looked down at the silver locket hanging from her neck, the only thing she owned that wasn't for sale or utility. It was a reminder of a life before the debt, before the city had swallowed her whole. She told herself that if she could just make it through the winter, things might change. It was a lie she told herself every evening at 6 o'clock, a small mercy to keep her hands moving. The smell of toasted sesame and frying dough drifted into the air, a warm scent that felt out of place against the cold concrete and the smell of exhaust. She didn't know that tonight the routine would break and the consequences would ripple out for years to come. The alleyway next to her cart was a dark throat of brick and discarded crates, a place she usually avoided looking into. But the sound that came from it wasn't the usual scuttle of rats or the rustle of wind-blown trash. It was a heavy, wet thud, followed by a low, jagged breath that sounded like tearing silk. Elena froze, her spatula hovering over the griddle. She looked left, then right. The street was momentarily empty, a rare pocket of stillness in the borough. She stepped away from the warmth of her stove, her boots crunching on the grit of the sidewalk. A man was slumped against a stack of wooden pallets, his silhouette sharp and expensive even in the gloom. He wore a dark suit that shimmered with the dull luster of high-quality silk, now marred by a spreading, darker stain across his ribs. His face was pale, his features striking and angular, a stark contrast to the grime of the alley. He looked to be about 31, with hair that was meticulously styled, but now matted with blood. He was Korean, his expression one of frozen, disciplined agony. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She should call for help, but she knew the neighborhood. An ambulance meant the police, and the police meant questions she couldn't answer and fees she couldn't pay. The man's eyes flickered open, a piercing, dark gaze that seemed to pin her to the spot. He didn't beg. He didn't even speak. He simply watched her with a terrifyingly calm intensity, his hand pressed firmly against his side, where the blood seeped through his fingers. Elena felt a surge of cold fear, the kind that settles in the marrow. She knew he was dangerous. Everything about his posture, even in near death, screamed of a power that didn't belong on this street. Yet, she saw the way his breath hitched, the way his fingers trembled against the silk. She thought of her own hunger, her own invisibility. "You're hurt," she whispered, the words feeling small and fragile. He didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he slumped further. She looked back at her cart, the steam rising into the night air, and then back at the dying man in the expensive suit. She moved without thinking, a sudden burst of frantic energy. She grabbed a clean kitchen towel and a container of hot water she kept for tea. She returned to the alley, kneeling in the dirt beside him. He flinched as she approached, his hand moving toward his jacket in a sharp, instinctive motion, but he didn't have the strength to follow through. "Don't," Elena said firmly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm just trying to stop the bleeding." She pulled back his jacket, her breath catching at the sight of the wound. It was a deep, jagged cut, likely from a blade. It wasn't a clean injury. She pressed the towel hard against his side, and he let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back against the bricks. His name was Kongdae, though she wouldn't know that for a very long time. To her, he was just a ghost in a suit. As she worked, she felt the sheer quality of his clothing, the weight of the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her entire life. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper, his English accented and precise. Elena didn't look up. "Because you're bleeding on my sidewalk," she replied, a flash of dry irony breaking through her terror. "And because no one should die in an alleyway alone." She managed to bind the wound tightly, her rough skin and the flour under her nails a testament to her work. She stood up, her knees aching. "Wait here," she said. She hurried back to the cart and prepared a fresh scallion pancake, folding it into a piece of wax paper. She added a small cup of ginger broth, the warmest thing she had. When she returned, he was still there, his eyes closed. He looked at the humble offering, then at her. He took the pancake, his fingers brushing hers. The warmth of the food seemed to ground him. He ate slowly, with a quiet, methodical dignity that felt out of place in the dirt. "I won't forget this," he said, his voice stronger now, though still thin. Elena just shook her head, gathering her things. "Just go before someone else finds you. I don't want any trouble." The next morning was gray and bitingly cold. Elena arrived at her corner at 5 a.m., her breath blooming in the air like smoke. She felt a lingering sense of dread, a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't shake. She kept looking toward the alleyway, half expecting to see a body or a pool of blood, but the rain had washed the pavement clean. The city was waking up, the roar of garbage trucks and the distant wail of sirens providing the soundtrack to her labor. She set up her griddle, the metal cold and stubborn. She thought about the man. He had disappeared by the time she had closed her cart the night before, leaving nothing behind but a blood-stained towel she had thrown away. She told herself it was over, a strange, dark anecdote in a life of many. She served a few early morning construction workers, their gruff voices a comfort in their familiarity. Then, at exactly 8 o'clock, the atmosphere on the street changed. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, heavy silence that rippled through the air. People stopped walking. The usual cacophony of the city seemed to dampen, as if someone had turned down the volume. Elena looked up from her batter. Coming down the narrow street were 5 massive, black SUVs, their windows tinted to a mirror finish. They moved in perfect, synchronized formation like a funeral procession or a military unit. They didn't slow down for the light. They simply took the space. They pulled up to the curb directly in front of her small, battered food cart, blocking the entire lane of traffic. Horns started to blare behind them, but the sound died out almost instantly as the doors of the vehicles opened in unison. Elena felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. She gripped the handle of her spatula so hard her knuckles turned white. This was the trouble she had feared. This was the systemic weight of a world she didn't belong to, arriving at her doorstep. A dozen men stepped out of the cars. They were all dressed in identical charcoal suits, their faces expressionless, their postures rigid. They didn't look like thugs. They looked like accountants who knew how to kill. They formed a perimeter around the cart, their eyes scanning the rooftops and the surrounding crowds. The middle SUV remained closed for a moment longer than the others. Elena stood frozen behind her counter, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt small, exposed, a target in a metal box. Then, the rear door of the center vehicle opened. A man stepped out. It was him. He was no longer the bleeding ghost in the alley. He wore a navy blue suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame, a white shirt crisp against his tan skin. A silk scarf was draped over his shoulders, and his hair was perfectly swept back. He walked with a slight limp, a subtle reminder of the night before, but his presence was overwhelming. He moved toward the cart, the crowd of onlookers parting like water before a ship. The men in suits bowed their heads slightly as he passed. He stopped at the edge of her counter, the smell of expensive cologne and cold air following him. Elena couldn't speak. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. The man looked at the griddle, then at the stack of napkins, and finally at her. His eyes were the same, dark, piercing, and terrifyingly calm. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and resonant, devoid of the rasp from the night before. Elena swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a whisper. "I told you I didn't want any trouble." The man leaned in slightly, his gaze never wavering. "You saved my life, Elena. I do not allow my debts to go unpaid." He gestured to the street, to the line of black cars and the men standing guard. "This is not trouble. This is the beginning of a balance being struck." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet, placing it on the grease-stained counter between them. The contrast was jarring, the luxury of the gift against the poverty of the setting. Elena stared at it, her hands trembling. "I just gave you a pancake," she said, her voice cracking. He smiled, a small, dangerous tilt of the lips. "It was the most expensive meal I have ever eaten." The velvet bundle sat on the stainless steel counter, looking entirely alien against the backdrop of cheap napkins and plastic forks. Elena didn't touch it. She looked at the man, Kong Dae, and saw the way the morning light caught the sharp line of his jaw. Behind him, the street had turned into a gallery of stunned faces. Commuters paused with their phones half raised, and the usual street-side hecklers were silent, intimidated by the sheer display of power. Kong Dae's world was narrowed down to the woman in front of him. "Open it," he commanded softly. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a threat either. It was the tone of a man used to the world bending to his will. Elena reached out, her fingers still dusted with a fine layer of flour, and pulled back the fabric. Inside lay a heavy gold coin, ancient and stamped with a sigil she didn't recognize, alongside a simple business card with nothing but a phone number and a name embossed in silver. "This is too much," she whispered, her voice lost in the sudden roar of a passing bus. "I didn't do it for this." Kong Dae leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. "You gave me dignity when I was dying like a dog in the dirt. That has no price. But in this city, dignity doesn't pay the rent." He looked at the dented metal of her cart, his eyes trailing over the rusted hinges and the flickering pilot light. "You will keep this. If anyone ever threatens you, if the people who collect your protection fees come back, you show them the coin. If they don't leave, you call the number." He stepped back, his movements fluid despite the bandage she knew was hidden beneath his shirt. The men in the charcoal suits moved in unison, preparing to depart as quickly as they had arrived. Elena felt a sudden spike of panic at the thought of being left alone with the aftermath of this spectacle. "Wait," she called out. He stopped, turning his head slightly. "Why are you doing this?" "Truly." Kong Dae looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the Mafia Boss slipped, revealing the tired man from the alley. "Because I lived," he said simply. Then he entered the SUV, the heavy door closing with a thud that sounded like a vault ceiling shut. The days that followed were characterized by a suffocating kind of peace. The local neighborhood thugs, men who usually swaggered past her cart to demand a sidewalk tax every Friday, suddenly became scarce. Elena watched from her station as they approached the corner, saw them spot her, and then abruptly crossed the street, their eyes fixed on the ground. The word had spread with the speed of a virus. The girl with the pancakes was under the shadow of a dragon. But protection came with its own weight. The silence of the street felt predatory. Elena felt the eyes of the shopkeepers on her, a mixture of envy and profound fear. She was no longer just a poor woman selling food. She was a landmark of a hidden war. She kept the gold coin hidden in a sock under her floorboards at home, but she kept the business card in her pocket, the sharp edges of the paper a constant reminder. 3 months passed. The winter deepened, turning the city into a jagged landscape of ice and gray slush. Elena's routine remained the same, but her internal world was fracturing. She found herself looking for the black SUVs in every line of traffic. She found herself remembering the way Kangdae had looked at her, not as a servant or a victim, but as an equal who had held his life in her hands. One evening, as the snow began to fall in heavy, wet flakes, a different car pulled up. It wasn't an SUV, but a sleek, silver sedan. A man stepped out, not in a suit, but in a heavy overcoat. He didn't bow. He didn't wait. He walked straight to the cart and placed a hand on the metal. "Elena," he said, his voice cold. "My name is Detective Miller. We need to talk about your friend." The interrogation didn't happen in a room with a swinging light bulb, but right there on the sidewalk, under the flickering neon of a nearby pharmacy. Miller was a man made of leather and cynicism, his eyes scanning Elena's face for any sign of a lie. "We know who he is," Miller said, gesturing vaguely toward the spot where the SUVs had parked months ago. "Kangdae is the head of a syndicate that makes the local gangs look like choir boys. He's been linked to 3 disappearances this month alone. And here you are, a girl who can barely pay for her permit. Suddenly, the most untouchable person on the block." Elena kept her hands busy, scrubbing the griddle with a wire brush until the metal shrieked. "I don't know anything about his business," she said, her voice flat. "He was hurt. I helped him." "That's the end of it." Miller leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "It's never the end. Men like him don't do charity. They do investments. He's using you, Elena. You're a blind spot, a way for him to move things or people without us looking too closely. If you help us, we can get you out of this. We can move you to another city, give you a fresh start." Elena stopped scrubbing. She looked at the detective, seeing the same systemic hunger she saw in the eyes of the tax collectors. "You weren't here when I was starving last winter," she said quietly. "You weren't here when the boys from the housing projects broke my cart's wheels for fun. Why are you here now?" Miller's face hardened. "Because now you're a liability. If you won't talk to us, you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And when it does, don't expect a badge to be there to catch you." He left a card next to her napkins, a white slip of paper that looked pathetic compared to the silver-embossed one in her pocket. Elena watched him walk away, the snow settling on her shoulders. The pressure was building, a slow-burn tension that felt like it would eventually shatter the glass of her life. The breaking point came 2 years later. Elena was 28 now, her face thinner, her hands more scarred. She had moved into a slightly better apartment, but she still ran the cart. It was her anchor, the only thing that kept her from floating away into the dark reality of Kangdae's world. She had seen him only twice in those years, brief, silent visits where he would buy a single pancake, pay with a $100 bill, and leave without a word. Each time, the air between them was thick with things unsaid. Then, the institutional antagonism the detective had warned her about finally struck. It wasn't the police, but the city's development board. A new high-rise was planned for her corner, and her permit, the one she had held for years, was suddenly revoked without explanation. When she went to the office to protest, a man in a cheap tie looked through her. "You don't have the standing, miss," he said, shuffling papers. "The area is being rezoned. You have 48 hours to clear the sidewalk, or we seize the equipment." Elena stood in the middle of the cold, fluorescent-lit hallway, feeling the familiar weight of injustice pressing down on her. She realized then that no matter how hard she worked, The system was designed to erase people like her. She walked out into the rain, her heart cold. She didn't go to the police. She didn't go to the city council. She went to a payphone 3 blocks away, pulled the silver embossed card from her wallet, and dialed the number. It picked up on the first ring. "I need help," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the exhaustion of years of endurance. There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of distant traffic and a quiet, rhythmic tapping. "Where are you?" a voice asked. It wasn't a subordinate. It was Kongdae. The resolution was not a battle, but a revelation of power. The next day, Elena stood by her cart, waiting for the city officials to arrive with their clipboards and their tow trucks. She had made no move to pack. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, sensing a confrontation. When the city truck arrived, 2 men in uniforms stepped out, looking bored and superior. "All right, lady, time's up," one of them said, reaching for the cart's tow hitch. Before he could touch it, the street went silent. The 5 black SUVs didn't crawl this time. They swerved onto the sidewalk, pinning the city truck against the curb. The doors opened, and 20 men stepped out, forming a wall of dark wool and stone-cold faces. Kongdae stepped out of the lead vehicle, looking older, a streak of silver now at his temple. He didn't look at the city workers. He walked straight to Elena. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "If I step in, the world will know you belong to me." Elena looked at the city workers, who were now backing away, their faces pale with the realization of who they had offended. She looked at the gray, towering buildings that had always tried to crush her. "I already belong to myself," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I'm tired of being stepped on." Kongdae nodded slowly. He turned to the city workers. "This ground is no longer for sale," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the air feel heavy. "Tell your masters that the debt on this corner has been paid in full." The workers didn't stay to argue. They scrambled back into their truck and fled. Kongdae turned back to Elena, his expression softening for the first time in years. "You kept the coin," he noted, seeing the gold chain now visible around her neck. "I kept it for a day like this," she replied. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, a rare moment of restraint. The long-term consequences of her choice were clear. She was now part of a world of shadows. But as she looked at the retreating city truck, she felt a sense of catharsis. Justice in this city wasn't found in books or badges. It was found in the loyalty of those the world had tried to discard. The routine of the cart would continue, but the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, dangerous hope.